Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our panel session. I'm sure that all of you are ready with many burning questions about the last session, which I sort of think of as a sci-fi session. And okay, so I think we already have some questions, so I think let's just jump in and get started, please.
I'm David Brown with Recombinetics. That was amazing. Thanks, all of you. As I look at what you're doing, you're essentially identifying these cell surface markers and operating literally at the quantum level. And does that mean that in actuality you are, and that many of these molecules are behaving probabilistically the same way that we would use quantum mathematics to describe their behavior, and that the probabilities and uncertainties that you see would be, at that same level, literally as you use the uncertainty principle in particle physics? I didn't think that was a hard question.
No, it's not a hard question. Yeah. No, it's just where do you enter it to talk about it. I mean, I think, yeah, we can talk about the quantum nature of the stochasticism of the cell. We've been developing some algorithms to deal with that. That was actually that stochastic paper there that right. Basically you can say that a given state of the cell has a stochastic outcome. And that you can use that stochasticism to actually move along a trajectory. So much as what Suchi showed, that as you learn more across that trajectory, you get to collapse the future states that the cell might enter because of prior knowledge. That's at least how we've been using it. I mean, people might have heard me talk in the past about we're actually building a quantum entanglement measurement device to actually, this actually gets to Lee's question about dynamics. Everything that I showed you is destructive, right, that we do. And so we have to come up with systems for measuring things at a distance without interfering with them, or minimally interfering with them. And so we've actually started designing some quantum measurement systems to measure at a distance.
Okay, so it is a real practical problem, not just theoretical.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, we weren't the first one to do quantum measurements at a distance. It's called ghost imaging, right? And we think we're going to be able to adapt it to
it's like
measure things in cells.
Hers is phantom statistics and phantom mathematics, following the same basic concept, right?
Actually, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about this, Garry. So can you say a little bit about what do you mean by quantum measurements? Because I think there are two aspects to this, right? One, you're saying the measurement device itself interferes with what you're measuring. And so effectively, it is in whatever state, it's stochastic, you have uncertainty over it, and by measuring, the process of measurement itself interferes with the state, and then it collapses onto something you get to observe. So that's one way to interpret.
I was talking about two things. The first was that as you measure more about the system, you collapse the future prediction, the uncertainty, like what you were showing with the other way, though. So the ghost imaging works like this: you take a photon, you basically make a quantum mirror of them, right? You entangle them. You send one photon down one direction with a multi-component detector, and then you send the other down with what's called a bucket detector. And the thing that you're interested in measuring is here. So let's say you had a fluorophore that was absorbed the light that came from this point. And you have the bucket detector just said, did I not, or did I see the light that came through? And then over here you have the multi-component CCD that gives you the spatial resolution. So you have a coincidence detector down here that says, I saw something here, I didn't see something there. I saw this by measuring this. Right, and you can do all kinds of angle games with this to actually get resolution that's beyond the limit of the light that you're measuring. And so then the idea is that the bucket detector you're going to change to have different kinds of measurement properties. Is it going to be measuring spin, all kinds of other features that you can introduce into the photon to hopefully, again, measure things at a distance. I'm measuring something here, I'm shooting it here, but I don't have the detector here. I have the detector over here.
I'm going to sit down, but could I just, to complete it, does that mean we're reaching a level where very soon we'll not be able to analyze biological events with any certainty, and it'll be totally probabilistic as we move forward?
So I think there's two things that are being talked about here that are distinct. So in terms of the types of systems that we were talking about today, they can often be described by a steady state or by a transition from one steady state to another. And that steady state may involve many different phenotypes of immune cells, cancer cells, tissue cells, what have you, that are all in cooperation. If it's a steady state, it means the inputs and the outputs are balanced. That's what it means. And it also means that if you perturb it, it'll respond back to restore that state. Now, as you go from a transition from wellness to disease or therapy response or what have you, you will lose that steady state description and move to a new one, okay? So you can certainly characterize those steady states. It's the pathways between the steady states that are stochastic. So anyone here who took freshman chemistry, who took freshman chemistry? And who remembers it? Everybody's hand goes down. So one thing you do in freshman chemistry is you do pressure volume expansions of ideal gases. And you always talk about the state functions, P1, V1, T1, P1, P2, V2, T2. You never concern yourself with the pathways between the states. Those are considered boring. That's work and heat. That just varies. But the state functions. And so if you have a steady state that describes a tissue, and it, because of some disease perturbation, it goes to a different steady state or maybe an unsteady state, the trajectories are random. They're stochastic, and you can show this. But the actual states are not. And they give you a predictive power. So you know population-wise where you'll end up and where you'll begin. You just don't know. And I think there's a lot of biology where people worry a lot about mechanisms, and I think you get lost in these pathways trying to worry about those mechanisms.
You know, stochasticism is something, I think of stochasticism as a search function, right? That you, if you were one cell, one state, you can only sample one environment. But if you're varying your state, you're sampling multiple environments. And so look at cancer. Cancer starts to get disorganized. It's sampling more states when it does so. And it's in any one state at a lesser amount of time so that the drug that might act upon it can't act because it's zooming through that state. It's the old idea that if you're running across a field and someone's going to shoot at you, don't run in a straight line.
Okay, I'm going to move us to the next question. Let's go to this side of the room.
Yeah, so my question's for Suchi, although I think it's relevant to all the panels. And it's this issue about sampling frequency. It seems to me that we always work with the data we get, yet we never really feed back into the system what would be optimal sampling frequency for different kinds of data, for different kinds of disease. So are you guys trying anything like that or thinking about that? Because I think the scleroderma with its different symptoms appearing at different times is like a perfect way to address this sort of problem.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. So I think if you have a model, if you have a notion of uncertainty, and you can assess what the uncertainty is looking like going forward, then you can ask the question of value of information, which is when can I sample and where do I sample in order to reduce the value of information. So in the inpatient setting, we're absolutely looking at this as a way to kind of guide areas where if they could have proactively gone and collected measurements, they could have reduced uncertainty. In the offline setting, which is scleroderma, this has been less so, as in, I think the idea would absolutely be, I mean, I would love to collaborate with someone who wants to do this. In scleroderma per se, we haven't done it because we just don't have in the inpatient setting, it's just really easy to do that. And outpatient, you know, you're sort of telling the patient, come back. That's just harder, you know, you can't play with them that much. But, you know, if you're looking at wearables, Mike, that's a very natural place to consider that, right? Like you have limited battery.
Right.
And so in Parkinson's, which is a study I didn't talk about, we've sort of been using this notion of like not consuming too much battery, so using value of information to drive when you sample from your iPhone so you don't run it down.
Of course, batteries are cheap, but that,
yeah.
Anyway, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Ravi Pandya, Microsoft Genomics. I had a question for Garry Nolan. Your modules looked really nice, and the question is, have you done enough samples that they are consistent across different individuals? Like, so can you use them as classifiers?
The answer is yes. Yeah, so you can imagine that even with, and so we've done like, random picking of 5 from a group of 50 patients and showing that another 5 has pretty much the same modules. So obviously there are differences, and the more patients, the more individuals you have, the more structured the modules become. The interesting thing was that when we compared, this was from 90 humans, females versus human males, there was more structure in females than there was in males, so women are more predictable. But actually, when you think about it, and we have to go back and check that, is that, well, what creates predictability? A clock, right? So do women have a clock that men don't have? Yes, right? They have a monthly clock, so maybe they're being reset on a regular basis. So the obvious thing to do is to look at premenstrual versus older women to see if that carries through.
Garry, I just tweeted that women are more predictable. You said that?
I know, I ducked. It was a joke. Don't call HR on me.
Yeah, this question is for Jim. How easy is it to adapt your sorting microfluidics technology to sort pathogens from infected tissue?
So the pathogens are generally pretty tiny, right?
Yeah, in the order of tens of microns or so.
Tens of microns.
Yeah.
Oh, then it's easy.
I mean, it's on the, about 4 to 10, is typically.
Yeah, that would be very straightforward, because these cells were no different that we were sorting.
This is a clinical question coming from a rheumatologist. So we're beginning to see more and more of these autoimmune reactions to checkpoint inhibitor therapy. So it's the yin and the yang, where we're seeing some nuisance cases, but also some fairly severe colitis, pneumonitis, et cetera. And I'm curious if in any of your samplings you've been able to see any of this signature for this potential beforehand in any of the cases that you've looked at so far, or if you've been addressed with this question about how to predict and or visualize this phenomenon at a cellular level a priori.
We haven't looked at any patients that we know of that have had any serious side effects over the long term. We've seen, I mentioned some of them that we see in the short term, not any sort of autoimmune responses. It's my understanding that those patients, they exist, but they're still pretty rare. So like a few percent.
The literature that we're seeing is that up to 50–60% of patients treated with checkpoint inhibitors will have some sort of autoimmune response, whether that be as mild as dermatitis or as mild as an arthropathy process, and it tends to be transient and responded to steroids. But there are also some patients that will develop, for example, a hypophysitis that will be a permanent issue, and increasingly conditions like lupus that are starting to emerge, and so I think it may be that we're just seeing a bit of the tip of the iceberg, and so that's something that we're fascinated by and curious about whether or not that's going to be visible before it happens.
These mild ones, yes, you can see those. They're pretty straightforward. The ones like lupus, I think I've even heard diabetes happening occasionally.
Correct.
My guess is that once we're able to dig much deeper into the CD4 T cell repertoire, we will know more about that. That's still, I would say, a hard problem. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of an obvious statement that the cohorts just don't exist with the longitudinal data that we can bring either my kind of analysis or Suchi's analysis to yet. But again, I think as I said before, heterogeneity is illusion. I'm sure that we're going to find them.
Thank you.
Actually, I have a couple of questions. Mark Curran Jansen, thank you guys for making the trip cross-country worthwhile. Gary, to follow up to the last question, and I don't know if this was at AACR yet, but it looks like there's a few patients that are hit with checkpoint inhibitors that actually have massive and very rapid growth of the tumor. I wonder if that's come out, sort of the opposite side of what's supposed to happen. Have you seen anything on that?
I haven't, but I really don't see the patients at that level.
So it'll probably be out in the literature. So it's sort of the opposite of what you would expect to get from a checkpoint inhibitor, right? So you get rapid tumor growth. It'd be really fascinating to be able to pick out those patients early.
When you say tumor growth, and actually I was wondering with your data where you saw is it tumor growth or is it inflammation of the tumor and?
So I know it may not be related, but when the first companies, there were a couple of companies developing CTLA-4 inhibitors, and the successful company is the one, they both saw the tumors grow, and the successful company decided that maybe it came from inflammation in the tumor, and they looked and that's what it was, and the other company abandoned the drug.
Right.
And so that may be it, but I mean, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense. So there's a recent trial result. So one typically thinks that CTLA-4 is working sort of outside the tumor, getting T cells to go and attack the tumor, and PD-1 releasing them once they're there. So they did a trial, I think it was a melanoma trial, where they did PD-1, then CTLA-4 on half the patients, and half of them they did CTLA-4, then PD-1. And you would normally think CTLA-4 plus PD-1 is going to work best. Mm-hmm. Wasn't nearly as good as PD-1 first, CTLA-4 second. Which tells us that we have this simple picture of how these checkpoints work, but it's not right. It's not quite right. There's pieces missing.
What do you think is missing? Is it that we don't have all the measurements? It's that our model is too simplistic? Or that we have the measurements, but we don't have a mental model and we need to search for a new mental model? Is it lack of the right hypotheses?
I don't know. You may know as well. So there's obviously been a lot of checkpoints and a lot of immunosuppressive mechanisms that have been identified. And some of them are metabolic signaling. Some of them are soluble factor signaling. Some of them are receptor-ligand interaction, like PD-1. And we know that sometimes PD-1 releases some of these other ones. And so, like interferon gamma is looked at in some cases as being related to a suppressive mechanism, but it's not what one normally thinks. And so I think that, this field went from really being a backwater to where it is in about 4 years' time, and the science simply hasn't caught up with trying to understand how all this stuff works, I think.
Well, I was looking at Wen Ying's talk this morning with the communities and thinking, God, could I use that kind of an approach on the local communities that we're looking at? So I was thinking metastasis, right? That's like you're subdividing the communities, and how many times does the metastasis set up the same features, and can you extract values out of that could be used in a back way to understand the tumor itself? So I didn't see microbes on your screen. I saw cancer metastases.
Yeah, Nathan Price, ISB. So this is a little bit of a follow-up to one of Jim's comments, but I'd love to get insights from any of the panelists. So Jim, you were talking about state functions. I did chemical engineering, so I remember chemistry. But so you're going from state function, and there's sort of this stochasticity, let's say, in transition. And so I think there is a lot of power to what you said. This is also an institute that's thinking a lot about disease transition and early transition and trying to reverse it. And some of the techniques we've been developing recently are really looking from defining of a wellness state and then divergence from there, sort of agnostic to what you're moving towards. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts a little bit, given that model that you set up, about how we might think about intervening in the divergence away from health when it is stochastic and the direction that you're going may be very different, even though it's pulling you to eventually that same attractor state.
Well, this is kind of a physicsy answer. But if you are measuring the right things in the system, generally it's going to be single cell levels. You're going to and molecular copies, and you're doing it dynamically. You're capturing the fluctuations of the system. I mean, you're capturing these little trajectories of the cells or the cell signaling that is going this way or that way as the cells move in one direction or another. Under a steady state, those fluctuations are going to be in Gaussian, unchanging in terms of its mean value, but a distribution of fluctuations around that. Okay, so that's one way of thinking a steady state, is that the inputs and outputs are balanced. Another way of thinking is that it's unchanging and your fluctuations are uniformly distributed about an average. Could be population profiles, could be, okay. If you're transitioning to disease, you have unbalanced processes, and they will skew those distributions. There's an absolute signature. I mean, I've seen this in, a while back, we had Larry Smarr here for some reason, or maybe it was this meeting, and he had this very aggressive approach to the gut microbiome, where he actually measured his own stool every single damn day for like a year. And he could absolutely see from the microbiome when he was sick, because you had a steady state, and then you had unbalanced processes that jumped. You didn't have to even fit the data. You could just see it by eye. And I think that I think that that's actually probably common signatures as you go from a health state to a disease state or back again.
Just to broaden out a little bit of what Jim is saying, I do think we're used to thinking of steady state as this Gaussian distribution in the mode, and because we can spot those by eyes very quickly. I think humans are so diverse. I would imagine there's a steady state distribution, not a steady state mode. So what this means is you could imagine having health being characterized as a steady state distribution, which means individuals could be in one of many modes. Any single mode sort of allows, a healthy, steady state to exist, if you will. That means you are not easily perturbed there, and then when you have disease, you end up in. So if you effectively think about it, it's probably some ridiculously high-dimensional space. There are some low-dimensional projections here of what health looks like. And it's probably not one ball. It's probably a whole collection of balls. And then, if you follow that idea, that maybe divergence from it is, so you could go diverging in all sorts of directions, right? And so representing that seems hard, but still interesting and exciting.
Yeah, thank you for sticking around for one last question. My name is Ryan Kirk. I'm actually not a biologist. I work in an industrial internet situation for one of the local cloud providers. So we monitor a different type of complex system. But what I've discovered is some of the models and techniques that use in epidemiology and biology are quite similar to the kinds of things that we are increasingly trying to use to discover the etiology of attack vectors and things like that. So my question is sort of hopefully plays out well on the question that was just asked, which relates to the idea of dynamical systems. But I really want to phrase it for the panel, but also I think it may apply most directly to Suchi and perhaps to Garry's research. So I'll start there and say, Garry has taken some of what Suchi has done and added a larger dimensionality to it that allows us to see more and more factors interacting, and I think that's great. And then you mentioned, vocally self-critical, which I think is also great. You talk about, maybe dynamically this has some things to think about that could be challenging. But now back to Suchi's presentation where we have time series data. Certainly in that situation, we can observe things in real time if we should so choose. So the question is really twofold. Suchi, with that approach, how will that scale to lots and lots of different attributes? Maybe thousands of attributes if you have such a system. And the second part of that question is, could you elaborate maybe a little bit about how you can observe the treatment effect in a system that's dynamical using your model or approaches that the panel has used elsewhere?
So I think to summarize, you asked me the second question. I'll answer first because I remember that, which is how do I estimate treatment effect in a dynamical data set? So I think one way to think about this is very simple. Let's say I give you the treatment. I see what you're doing now. I see you after I give you the treatment. and I do this repeatedly in a population, then I can effectively, intuitively figure out what the treatment effect is, right? Because I can see what the difference that happened. Now, the thing is that simple idea doesn't quite work as is, because the reality is it's possible you had a natural drift in your own baseline. So the treatment effect is not just kind of before-after subtraction, but it's what you would have been had you not been treated versus what I got to observe if you did get treated. So effectively, it turns into this problem of trying to figure out what's called the counterfactual. And the counterfactual here is if you didn't get treated, what would you have been, right? And so now the question is, how do you, if you have a ton of people and you have people like this person, then maybe just using exactly the kinds of models I spoke about, you can actually do counterfactual inference of what you would have looked like had you not been treated. You look at the difference and you get treatment effects out of that. So I don't know if that answers your question. So in a dynamical system, so this is sort of the kernel of the idea, and you can apply this when you're applying it to the kinds of data we spoke about, which is super high dimensional, lots of treatment having multiplicative effects. You don't get to measure things all at the same time, then you have to just sort of do things to account for all of those idiosyncrasies. But the kernel of the idea still remains the same.
And I guess just to follow up with that first question was just how well do you think either latent factors model or some of these other models will scale up to larger and larger numbers of variables?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So I think increasingly we're developing machinery in computer science, machine learning, to deal with very, very large-scale latent factor models. For instance, the kinds of models that I spoke about are already dealing with easily 100 million variables. So for instance, if you had a large network with, 100,000 computers, and you're trying to think about networks and 100,000 computers, a million computers, that's actually not, that's doable. And part of it is these algorithms become parallelizable. So when it's embarrassingly parallel, it's nice because you get time from throwing money at it, right? You just are sort of looking at adding more computers to do the processing.
Okay, with that, I would like to thank our panelists for a wonderful discussion, and thank you all. And